من غير سوء آية أخرى لنريك من آياتنا الكبرى اذهب إلى فرعون إنه طغى قال رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي تخرج بيضاء عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي واجعل لي وزيرا من أهلي هارون أخي أشدد به أزري وأشركه في أمري كي نسبحك كثيرا ونذكرك كثيرا إنك كنت بنا بصيرا قال قد أوتيت سؤلك يا موسى ولقد مننا عليك مرة أخرى إذ أوحينا إلى أمك ما يوحى أن اقذفيه في التابوت فاقذفيه في اليم فليلقه اليم بالساحل يأخذه عدو لي وعدو له وألقيت عليك محبة مني ولتصنع على عيني إذ تمشي أختك فتقول هل أدلكم على من يكفله فرجعناك إلى أمك كي تقر عينها ولا تحزن وقتلت نفسا فنجيناك من الغم وفتناك فتونا فلبثت سنين في أهل مدين ثم جئت على قدري يا موسى واصطنعتك لنفسي اذهب أنت وأخوك بآياتي ولا تنيا في ذكري اذهبا إلى فرعون إنه طغى فقولا له قولا لينا لعله يتذكر أو يخشى قالا ربنا إننا نخاف أن يفرط علينا أو أن يطغى قال لا تخافا إنني معكما أسمع وأرى فأتياه فقولا إنا رسولا ربك فأرسل معنا بني إسرائيل ولا تعذبهم قد جئناك بآية من ربك والسلام على من اتبع الهدى إنا قد أوحي إلينا أن العذاب على من كذب وتولى قال فمن ربكما يا موسى قال ربنا الذي أعطى كل شيء خلقه ثم هدى قال فما بال القرون الأولى قال علمها عند ربي في كتاب لا يضل ربي ولا ينسى الذي جعل لكم الأرض مهادا وسلك لكم فيها سبلا وأنزل من السماء ماء فأخرجنا به أزواجا من نبات شتى كلوا وارعوا أنعامكم إن في ذلك لآيات لأولي النهى منها خلقناكم وفيها نعيدكم ومنها نخرجكم تارة أخرى ولقد أريناه آياتنا كلها فكذب وأبى قال أجئتنا لتخرجنا من أرضنا بسحرك يا موسى فلنأتينك بسحر مثله فاجعل بيننا وبينك موعدا لا نخلفه نحن ولا أنت مكانا سوى قال موعدكم يوم الزينة وأن يحشر الناس ضحى فتولى فرعون فجمع كيده ثم أتى قال لهم موسى ويلكم لا تفتروا على الله كذبا فيسحتكم بعذاب وقد خاب من افترى فتنازعوا أمرهم بينهم وأسروا النجوى قالوا إن هذين لساحران يريدان أن يخرجاكم من أرضكم بسحرهما ويذهبا بطريقتكم المثلى فاجمعوا كيدكم ثم أتوا صفا وقد أفلح اليوم من استعلى قالوا يا موسى إما أن تلقي وإما أن نكون أول من ألقى قال بل ألقوا فإذا حبالهم وعصيهم يخيل إليه من سحرهم أنها تسعى فأوجس في نفسه خيفة موسى قلنا لا تخف إنك أنت الأعلى وألق ما في يمينك تلقف ما صنعوا إنما صنعوا كيد ساحر ولا يفلح
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. We begin with the praise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to send his peace and blessings upon his final messenger, Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, upon his family, his companions, and all those who follow his way until the day of judgment. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us amongst them. So alhamdulillah, we thank all of you for joining us in this afternoon before, inshallah, Salat al-Asr and these last moments of the month of Ramadan, discussing a topic of critical importance. I reached out to our esteemed guests, Mufti Abrar Mirza and Brother Naveed Hussein, who's a lawyer in the local area, and they were gracious enough to give us their time in these last moments of Ramadan. And I know they're very busy with their personal efforts and personal acts of worship and such, and other responsibilities. But they were gracious enough to give us their time, inshallah ta'ala, to discuss this topic, partially because of the imminence of what's going on. I feel as though many people that are close to us, near and dear to us, unfortunately, either they have sick family members or they have family members who have passed away. Then, of course, we have our circumstances with the pandemic. And so a lot of people are thinking about this more than ever before, which is in a way a blessing, because this is from our noble tradition to secure an Islamic will. So I don't want to take too much more time, inshallah ta'ala, because we have a great discussion ahead of us with our esteemed guests. I wanted to introduce our first speaker, Mufti Abrar Mirza. He's a close friend of mine, alhamdulillah. We had the honor of being in school together at Benedictine University, where he graduated with a degree in information systems. And actually, it was amazing at that time. During that period, he had been enrolled in Dar al-Qasim, and then thereafter at the Islamic Institute of Elgin, where he studied the Dars al-Nizami and was one of the earlier graduates from the Alim program there, mashallah. And soon after, he was able to graduate from Benedictine, and then he went and completed his studies at the Madrasat al-Na'amiyya in South Africa, where he had a specialization in fatwas under the auspices of Mufti Ibrahim Desai, mashallah. So thereafter, Mufti Abrar, he was a founder of the American Fiqh Academy and is active in a number of areas of research in Islamic fatwas, and continues to give services to the United States, but especially to our local area in Chicago. So alhamdulillah, we're happy to have Mufti Abrar, inshallah, joining us. Jazakallahu khairan.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah. الحمد لله الذي هدى والصلاة والسلام على عباده الذين اصطفى خصوصا على سيد الرسل وخاتم الأنبياء وعلى آله وصحبه الذين اجتبى أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ووصى بها إبراهيم بنيه ويعقوب يا بني إن الله اصطفى لكم الدين فلا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون أم كنتم شهداء إذ حضر يعقوب الموت إذ قال لبنيه ما تعبدون من بعدي قالوا نعبد إلهك وإله آبائك إبراهيم وإسماعيل وإسحاق إلها واحدا ونحن له مسلمون. Respected listeners, first of all, I would like to thank ICNA and the Islamic Learning Academy and Brother Arif for hosting this program, arranging it. Definitely, this is a topic of much importance and one that is not as often discussed as perhaps it should be. I've had the honor of hosting this program a few times before with Hafiz Naveed, and one of them by ICNA before as well. So alhamdulillah, I'm glad that the proper attention is being given to this area, and this is a topic that is of utmost importance, and inshallah there's a lot to cover, and we will try to move through it fairly quickly, inshallah. I want to first start by saying that the purpose of this discussion here is for us to understand what's the Islamic approach and preparation toward the death of oneself or a loved one. And it's a topic that perhaps is not always very comfortable for us to discuss, but it is one that we need to understand and be aware of. And more than that, it's also to take necessary actions that can come out from this. So it's not simply just a matter of learning, but knowledge should transfer into actions thereafter. The agenda that we'll cover is, first we'll talk about, before you talk about the Islamic will and the distribution of the estates and such, first you have to talk about just the preparation of the death itself, the Islamic approach to preparing for death. And then we'll talk about inheritance and bequests. We'll talk about what's the Islamic method in terms of reacting to death, how the estate should be distributed. And we'll also clarify some misconceptions, particularly one that comes up a lot. And then we'll give some practical advices. And then thereafter, the theory that we will learn and some of the practicalities that we will learn will then continue into Hafiz Naveed, who will then put the aspect of how that applies within the law of the law of the land, and how to make what we are learning here be executable given the context of the Islamic law, or the US law and the state law, in fact, that we live with. First of all, we must recognize, as we talk about this topic, is there is only one real certainty in life, and that life will come to an end. Okay? Allah SWT mentions that وَمَا جَعَلْنَا لِبَشَرٍ مِّن قَبْلِكَ الْخُلْدَ أَفَإِن مِتَّ فَهُمُ الْخَالِدُونَ كُلُّ نَفْسٍ ذَائِقَةُ الْمَوْتِ وَنَبْلُوكُم بِالشَّرِّ وَالْخَيْرِ فِتْنَةً وَإِلَيْنَا تُرْجَعُونَ. That we haven't allowed any person before you, Prophet ﷺ, to live for eternity. So what do people think? That you're going to pass away and then they're going to live forever? That no, everyone's going to pass away and everyone's going to then return back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the concept of death in our deen is not something that you just know it's a certainty and will happen and then you just wait for it. Rather, it's something that we prepare for it. Most of you may know of the famous hadith where a person came and asked the Prophet ﷺ, when is the hour? And the response of the Prophet ﷺ to that person was, what have you prepared for it? Right? That it's not simply something you wait for, it's something that you must prepare for. Allah SWT mentions in the Quran, فَسَبِّحْ بِحَمْدِ رَبِّكَ وَكُن مِّنَ السَّاجِدِينَ وَاعْبُدْ رَبَّكَ حَتَّى يَأْتِيَكَ الْيَقِينُ. That glorify Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, praise him, and be amongst those who prostrate to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and worship your Lord until yaqeen comes to you, until certainty comes to you. And here referring to until death comes to you, that there's actions you must take until that death eventually comes to you. Okay? And we know that there is the Yawm al-Qiyamah, that's the major day of judgment, there's a major Qiyamah, but then there's also a smaller Qiyamah, which is when every one of us passes away. That's our own personal smaller Qiyamah, and it's something that requires preparation. And one of the first things that we must do to prepare for it is that we must pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows us that after living a life trying to obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and staying away from sins, that we pass away with Iman. That we know that Shaitan is a sworn enemy, that this is a sworn and clear enemy, that he's going to try till the very end to take a person out of the fold of Islam, and we should make dua that we pass away with Iman. And likewise, while we make dua for ourselves, we must also be concerned about our families, and we must advise our families to stay firm on the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The ayahs that are recited in the beginning from Surah Baqarah, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about when Yaqub alayhi salam was approaching his time of passing away. And he called his children, he said, "Ma ta'buduna min ba'di," that what are you going to worship after me? And they said, "Na'budu ilahaka wa ilaha abaika Ibrahim wa Ismaila wa Ishaqa ilaha wahida wa nahnu lahu muslimun." And they said that we're going to worship our, the one Lord of our, who is our Lord, the Lord of our forefathers, Ibrahim and Ismail and Ishaq, and we have submitted to him. And that was something then that gave comfort to Yaqub alayhi salam, that this is something that we must do, that we must not only make dua for ourselves, but we must make sure we are advising our family of what they should do after we pass away. One is obviously remaining firm on Iman, but it's also other things such as making sure that they avoid haram things at the time of our passing away. So, things such as wailing and such, but also in speech, that they must be mindful of what they say, so that nothing wrong comes out from their mouth, right? It could be something such as saying somebody passed away early, somebody passed away before their time or such, right? These are incorrect statements. Nobody passes away early, nobody passes away before their time. Yeah, somebody may pass away at a young age, but that's different. but nobody passes away before their time. Everyone passes away at the time that has been appointed for them. So to advise one's family is part of preparation for your own death. And finally, must settle debts. We know the example of the shaheed, that person who's a martyr in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how beloved is that person to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that we are even asked to bury that person in the same state that they passed away in, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants that person in that state. And his sins, the hadith mentions that the sins that are forgiven even before the first drop of blood falls to the ground. Yet Abdullah ibn Umar ibn As radiallahu anhu narrates that the Prophet ﷺ said, يُغْفَرُ لِلشَّهِيدِ كُلُّ ذَنْبٍ إِلَّا الدَّيْنِ, comes in Sahih Muslim, that even for that shaheed, every sin is forgiven except for debts. That's something that they should have taken care of. And we know that the beloved Messenger of Allah ﷺ would not even pray initially the janazah of a person who passed away without settling their debts. Jabir radiallahu anhu mentions that كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم لا يصلي على رجل مات وعليه دين. Prophet would not do that. فأتي بميت فقال عليه دين. That once the janazah was brought in, the Prophet asked, does that person have a dain? Does that person have a debt on him? And they said, Naam dinaran. They say, yes. How much of a debt? 2 dinars. 2 dinars. That's about, well, you can say 5% of the nisab, if you will, right? So it's less than $250, meaning it's a minimal amount that was on him. Yet the Prophet said, Sallu ala sahibikum, that you guys go ahead and you pray on that person. So then the Sahaba, they had concern for one another. So Abu Qatada radiallahu anhu, then he said, Humma aliya ya Rasulullah, that those 2 dinars, I have taken the responsibility now. So please pray on this person now, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So now Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam thereafter then prayed on that person. And eventually, فلما فتح الله على رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال أنا أولى بكل مؤمن من نفسه فمن ترك دينا فعلي قضاؤه ومن ترك مالا فلورثته. Eventually, later on, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala opened up the land, or opened up the wealth for the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then he said that if someone passes away and they have a debt, then I will take care of it. And if someone passes away and they have wealth, then that wealth is for their inheritors. Right? But initially, you see that the Prophet would not even, when there was no way of settling a person's debt, the Prophet wouldn't pray that person's janazah, given the seriousness of it. Okay? And this inheritance and bequest, and we'll talk about what those mean, but this is a very important aspect of our deen. It's a very important aspect of our deen. Yes, salah is important, Sawm is important, Hajj is important, but this is also important as well. Okay? And you see that no other ibadah has been mentioned with such granularity, such details as the topic of inheritance has been mentioned. Okay? Salah, that's prayed 5 times a day. Sawm, that's fasted, Ramadan fast a full month every year. But yet, if you look at Surah Nisa, especially in verses 11 to 13, you see the detail that the Quran goes in under. Right? For the husband is this much if there's children. If there's no children, then it's this other amount. For the wife is this amount. If there's no children, if there's children, then it's this amount. And it goes into all those details that you don't find for other ibadat, getting into that level of detail. And the Prophet mentioned, تَعَلَّمُوا الْفَرَائِضِ وَعَلِّمُوهَا النَّاسِ فَإِنَّهَا نِصْفُ الْعِلْمِ, that study this aspect of inheritance and teach it to people, that this is half of knowledge. Okay? And Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhu mentions that قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم that ما حق امرئ مسلم له شيء يوصى فيه يبيت ليلتين إلا وصية مكتوب عنده. That in general, that if someone has something that needs to be documented for what they need to leave behind, that not even 2 nights should pass without that person then documenting that. Okay? And this is muttafaq alayhi, Sahih Bukhari and Muslim both. And we take from that especially in where we live, where the laws of inheritance don't automatically get applied by the state, right? That you need to document how you want your inheritance to be taken care of after you, that not even 2 nights should pass without you having taken care of that. Okay? And there's 2 different things here. There's mirath and then there's wasiyah, inheritance and bequests. Okay, mirath is inheritance, and inheritance is those amounts that are specifically mentioned in the Quran, right? The shares that have been specified in the Sharia that are non-negotiable. Okay? And it's set that if you want to leave behind extra for your wife, you can't do that. There's a set percentage for her, for example. Okay? And at the same time, no one can be excluded from their right of inheritance. Right? For example, if a person has a disobedient child, Allah, Allah forbid, that the person can't say, I'm going to deprive them of my inheritance. That cannot be done. These are shares that have been set and specified in the Quran. They're not negotiable. And then you have what's called wasiyah, or bequests. This is where a person has a choice for up to 1/3 of their wealth of how they wish to use it. Okay, Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas radiallahu anhu mentions that, maridtu aam al-fathi maradan, that I felt that ashfaytu ala al-maut, that I got so sick at one point that I thought I was going to pass away. فأتاني رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يعودني فقلت يا رسول الله إن لي مالا كثيرا وليس يرثني إلا ابنتي. That O Prophet of Allah صلى الله عليه وسلم, that I have a lot of wealth and I don't really have many inheritors. أفأوصي بمالي كله, that can I just bequest all of my wealth? So can I just say that after I pass away, all of my wealth should be given in the path of Allah, for example? So the Prophet said, La. He said, no, you can't do that. So he said, فَثُلُثَيْ مَالِي, what about 2/3? Can I bequest 2/3 of my wealth, here? And the Prophet said, La, no, you can't do that. He said, فَالشَّطْرُ, what about half? The Prophet said no to that as well. And then eventually, Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas radiallahu anhu asked, فَالثُلُث, what about 1/3 of my wealth? So the Prophet said, الثُلُث وَالثُلُثُ كَثِيرٌ. That yes, you can bequest up to 1/3 of your wealth, and even that is a lot. Okay, that إنك إن تذر ورثتك أغنياء خير من أن تذرهم عالة يتكففون الناس وإنك لن تنفق نفقة تبتغي بها وجه الله إلا أجزت بها حتى اللقمة ترفعها في إمرتك. That said that if you were to leave behind your inheritors wealthy, that's better than if you were to leave behind them in a financial distressful situation. That here the Prophet is explaining that don't think that the reward in your wealth is only when you spend it in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That if you were to say that I pass away and give all my wealth in the path of Allah, that is rewarding. No, even money that you leave behind for your inheritors, that's a reward, that's a rewarding act. Okay, even that is good, and you will be rewarded even for that. Okay? Yet the Prophet said you have the dispensation for up to 1/3 of your wealth. You can do as you wish. Okay? But there are certain restrictions in that. One, you cannot bequest anything to somebody who's already going to inherit from you, because so inheritors are ineligible for your bequests. The Prophet mentioned that إن الله قد أعطى إن الله قد أعطى كل ذي حق حقه فلا وصية لوارث. That Allah has given everyone their due share. That the inheritors have been given the share that they deserve, and فلا وصية لوارث. So you cannot bequest to them. They have their full share as been determined by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, so in this 1/3, up to 1/3 of your wealth, that you have the freedom or you have the leeway to designate that wealth as you wish. One is you cannot give it to somebody who's inheriting. Okay? But you can give it to somebody else who's not going to inherit. So for example, in many situations, a brother or sister is not going to inherit from you. You can leave behind some of that wealth for your brothers or your sisters. Okay? Or for adopted children, right? They're not automatic inheritors from your wealth, but you can bequest money to them up to 1/3. Okay? Also, if somebody has passed away and they haven't had a chance to make up all of their missed fasts, for example, then you can bequest that those missed fasts be expedited from your 1/3 of your bequests here. And for each missed fast, the amount of sadaqat al-fitr should be given. Okay? Now, you leave that behind while you're alive, and then eventually, everyone will pass away. And when we pass away, then it's natural for family to grieve. Okay, that's natural for a person. The Sharia doesn't restrict that. The Sharia doesn't say that you cannot grieve on those who have passed away. That's naturally going to happen. Okay? But there are certain limits to that. Okay? We know the famous hadith when the Prophet ﷺ son Ibrahim passed away, there was an eclipse, and some said that the eclipse is in response to the passing away of his son, and it's out of sadness and such. And the Prophet said, no, the sun and the moon do not eclipse for the death of anyone. And he said that that the eyes tear and the heart is saddened, but we do not say anything except that which pleases our Lord. that he said, "Indeed, O Ibrahim, we are bereaved by your departure." And then he turned toward a mountain. He said, "O mountain, if you were as sorrowful as I am, you would certainly crumble into pieces." Okay, that's how much grief the Prophet had in his heart. But he said, "But we say what Allah's orders say, Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un." Okay? That grieving is natural, but a person should be mindful of what they say and how they react. It should not violate the laws of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Also on the family, what's necessary is they must rush the janazah. There's no reason to delay the janazah. Okay, the Prophet Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu anhu mentions that the Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam قال له يا علي ثلاث لا تؤخرها. But three things, don't ever delay them unnecessarily. Okay, الصلاة إذا أتت or إذا آنت. Okay, والجنازة إذا حضرت والأيم إذا وجدت له كفوا. That prayer when the time is entered, don't delay it unnecessarily. The janazah when it's ready, don't delay janazah unnecessarily. And that person who is suitable to be married off, that when you find a proper match for that person, then don't delay that marriage. Okay, these three things should not be delayed. So janazah should be rushed, it should not be delayed unnecessarily. Okay? Also, we should send thawab for those who have passed away, the concept of ithal al-thawab, that you give some sadaqah and you recite some Quran and you intend that the thawab, you will get the thawab, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also sends the thawab to those who pass away. That these are, this is how we react to when somebody passes away. Thereafter, the distribution of the estate is going to be on the family, right? The person who's passed away, he or she has left behind the instructions of what must happen, but the execution will be on the family. Okay? So the first thing that happens is from a person's estate that they left behind, the burial expenses are subtracted. Okay, and this includes the expenses for the burial, the grave site and such. It doesn't include expenses related to people visiting the family and cooking food and feeding people and things of that nature. Not that. Just those expenses related to the burial. Only that should be subtracted from the estate. Thereafter, if the person passed away and there's some debts that had to be settled, then these debts will be first settled from the estate. Okay? Allah forbid, if the debts exceed the estate, then either the creditors can forgive and inshallah they'll be rewarded for that, or friends and family can voluntarily pay it off. And if that's not the case, then the creditors will be given the entire remaining amount in proportion to their claims. So for example, A was owed 1,000 and B was owed 500. Then from the remaining estate, A will be given 2/3 and B will be given 1/3 in order to settle the debt. Okay? If there isn't, let's say 1,500 remaining to give the full amount. So first the burial expense will be subtracted, then the debts will be settled, and then from the remaining estate, you will see, did the person leave behind any wasiyah, any bequest? Person doesn't have to, it's optional. And if they did, then you will take care of the wasiyah, but it will only be limited up to 1/3 of the wealth. Okay? If it's more than 1/3, then that will not be honored. Okay, unless all the other inheritors agree to it, that's different. But otherwise, it will only be limited to 1/3. So if a person said, to give sadaqah, to give fidya for misfast and such, that will be taken care of up to 1/3. And then finally, the mirath, the inheritance will be taken care of. So all the shares of the inheritors, as is defined, they will be given their shares, and there's no option to change that. Okay. Now, how much does a person get in mirath? What is the share of a person? These depend on different scenarios. So even for questions, when we have questions at the end, I request that the questions be kept at a general concept level, and for any specifics of how much a person is going to inherit in these specific cases and such, I can share my email address with Brother Arif, and you can get my email address through him and ask at a on a private level. But the exact percentages may change depending on the circumstances of who's alive and such.
Sorry, I'm not sure if you're sharing your screen or you intended on sharing your screen. It's not showing up.
It's not, screen hasn't been showing up this whole time?
That's correct, yeah.
Oh. Okay. Do you see it now? Okay. So, all right. I didn't realize the screen wasn't showing. Okay, but if it's working now. Okay, so let's clarify a misconception that's often asked, which is that this concept of للذكر مثل حظ الأنثيين, that women are given, or the men have twice the share for as for women. And sometimes people think that is that unfair or such, that men have a higher share than women. And the reality of that is that is not true. That is not accurate. Okay. There's a difference between the rights that a man has and the rights that a woman has in their wealth. Okay. The woman's wealth is for herself only, meaning she has no obligation to spend that money on anyone else. Whereas for a man, the man has obligations in their wealth, in his wealth. Okay, he must spend that, he must support his wife, he must support his children. If there's other family members who are in need of financial help, he must support them as well. Okay? Also, Sheikh Ali Jum'a, who was a former Grand Mufti of Egypt, he pointed out some interesting numbers. He mentioned that there's 4 scenarios where a woman inherits less than a man, but there's 11 scenarios where a woman inherits the same as a man. And then there's 14 scenarios where a woman inherits more than a man. Okay. And then there's other scenarios where a woman inherits and a man does not inherit. Okay. But regardless of the details of those scenarios and such, the important thing is that the Prophet has mentioned that inna Allah qad a'ta kulla dhi haqqin haqqa, that Allah has given everyone their due rights. So it's not for us to question that this person has, or this family member has this share. Is that too much? Is that too little? Should they be given more or less or such? That is not for us to do. Some practical advices. Okay. One is regarding distributing of shares in one's lifetime. Okay. This is the most effective in avoiding disputes, right? There's unfortunately too many cases where people, questions come about disputes within the family on matters of inheritance, and I've even dealt with one where one of the family members even pulled out a weapon on the other family member. Okay? There's one of the best ways to avoid this, besides having everything clearly documented, is if a person were to distribute a large share of their estate within their lifetime. It's not, and this would not technically be mirath, which only happens after death, but at least it reduces the likelihood of dispute over large amounts of wealth after they pass away. Now, a person should be careful not to give away all of their wealth within their lifetime. You should keep money for yourself so that you're not dependent on others. But this is one thing that a lot of times people do in their lifetime. The other thing to be mindful of is clarifying how joint family homes work. Okay, so a lot of times what happens is, the house is under the name of the parent, of the father, of the mother, or both parents, for example. But really, the adult son, for example, is the one who's living in the house, who's been paying the monthly payments and the expenses of the house and such for a large number of years. And then when the parent passes away, then the inheritors say that, well, the house must be distributed according to the laws of inheritance. And then the son who had been living in the house says, no, this house actually, was in the name of the father out of respect, but really this house is mine and I've been making payments and so on. And it gives rise to disputes. So in any of these cases where there's more than one family in the house, or it's a case where the house in the name of the parents and one of the children, or more, one or more of the children are taking care of the expenses, it should be clear on who actually owns the house, and those things should be clarified. When a person leaving behind their will, you should know to leave behind all the necessary details. Okay? So, for example, who's the executor? How should that, who should execute the will? If a person had hajj that had to be done, or fast that had to be made up and such, then that should be documented and such. And if who should perform the hajj on your behalf? How many fasts were incomplete and such? These things should be clarified as well. it's also good to say that, in case of any dispute amongst the family, here's the group of scholars or the scholars of this or the Darul Iftar or whatever who should be resorted to clarify, and whatever they decide should be accepted by the family and as a means of resolving disputes. But all the necessary details should be included. This includes also matters of custody of the children. That should be clarified in the will as well. Okay. Medical treatment is something that must be documented. Okay. This is a very sensitive topic for the family. Okay. If a person is on, is essentially on life support, and a Muslim doctor has mentioned that there's really no likelihood of improvement in that person's condition, then it's not necessary to continue medication or continue treatment for that person. Meaning that the medical treatment could be withdrawn. But that's a very sensitive decision for the family to make, and it can give rise to disputes among family members. So it's best if a person within their own will were to say that, if this was the medical condition, then here's what I would want. That I would want this in these cases for the medication or the medical treatment to be withdrawn, for example. Then that way the family members don't have to make that sensitive decision themselves. It avoids any disputes. They can say this was the wish of this person, and hence we will simply execute their wish. Okay. And for the family, execute the will in a timely manner, okay, as soon as possible. Okay. Right after the family member passes away, the hearts are soft and they're bonded together. Mutual distrust brings people together, and it's easier to amicably agree and settle on matters. Okay. So it's best if this is executed and taken care of in a timely and quick manner. Okay. And finally, no one should forego their share. Okay. No one should say that I don't want my inheritance, right? The sister, for example, of a parent passed away, so now amongst the brothers and sisters, the sister is, she's from her husband is, let's say, wealthy, and she's in a very comfortable financial situation. She shouldn't say that, let the brothers take my share as well, I don't want it. Okay. That's not valid to begin with, and it should not be done. Okay. What happens is memories fade over time, and then ill feelings start to develop. So although somebody may have very voluntarily given up their share, later on they don't recall that, they don't remember that, they say my share wasn't given, or that I was in an emotional state and my brothers took advantage of me and deprived me of my share and such. So in order to avoid that, no one should forego their share. Okay. So if we were to do this, then inshallah, this important aspect of our deen and this responsibility will then be taken care of. I'll just mention in concluding that it's a very important topic. It's not addressed as often as it must be. And this can make the difference between ties of kinship and unity of family being retained or breaking. And unfortunately, we see that a lot. Okay? And all of us should make sure that we pass away in such a state that we have taken care of our obligations, that we should not pass away in such a state that because the lack of our fulfillment of our obligations, we have now become a means of fitna and haram and dispute for other people. Okay? That we should pass away in a state that we should make sure that we have taken care of our responsibilities to the best of our extent. Okay? And then thereafter, we leave it to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grants us a death on Iman, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala strengthens the bond of love between our families within our lifetimes and after our lifetimes as well. And with that, wa akhiru da'wan alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. I turn it over to Hafiz Naveed to then take this and to apply that within the laws of the land as well.
May Allah ta'ala reward you and accept it from you.
Yeah, and my apologies for I didn't realize the slides in the beginning were not being shared.
I take responsibility too. I tried texting you, but I know you're focusing on your presentation. May Allah reward you, inshallah. So, inshallah, for those of you who have joined us, alhamdulillah, we have a number of people on YouTube as well as the Zoom environment. Those of you who are in the Zoom environment, inshallah, we will have a detailed Q&A section at the end. And I know that's where a lot of the discussion will happen. So if you have any questions, there's a Q&A feature. You can ask your questions there, and then we'll make sure they're addressed at the Q&A session. You can also ask it in the chat. Those of you who are on YouTube or Facebook, you can ask it in the live chats there as well, inshallah. And those of you who are in the Zoom environment, when we have the Q&A session, you can raise your hand and you have an opportunity to ask a question via audio as well. So without further ado, we'll move on to our next presenter, Hafid Naveed. He is, mashallah, a family law attorney in the Oak Brook area with Farouqi and Hussein law firm. He graduated with his JD from Marquette University Law School and has part of the Illinois and Wisconsin bar. He enjoys researching and finding unique solutions to integrate Islamic law within the US legal framework, which is part of the reason why he's here, mashallah. He's also a part-time student at Dar al-Qasim with the Sheikh al-Hind program, which allows him to engage with the ulama and the scholars, specifically addressing legal issues when necessary. He is also invited to speak across the Midwest to discuss estate planning and divorce matters. So without further ado, we have Brother Naveed.
Assalamu alaikum. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulihil Nabiyil Kareem wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. First of all, jazakumullahu khair to ICNA Chicago, to ILF and Brother Arif for inviting me. Alhamdulillah, I always am humbled by having my name on the same flyer as Mufti Abrar, but alhamdulillah, we've been doing this for a few years now, and we've had the opportunity to do this in multiple venues. So I'm very excited and very humbled to do this again with Brother Mufti Abrar Mirza Saab. And so, inshallah, I just wanted to kind of set a little background. So I've been practicing law for, I think, 7-8 years now. And my specialty is really family law. So really what that comes down to is estate planning and divorce. So I see firsthand the, unfortunately, the fighting and the litigation that takes place between family members when families are breaking apart, or when a family member passes away and now the property being divided amongst the family. So I do have a firsthand experience dealing with those issues. And that really, goes to show you the importance of this topic, because I'm sure that all of us have heard of our own family members having these issues, or maybe we've gone through these issues, and how this planning is so important, and how actually the Sunnah and our Deen teaches us to plan these things ahead of time. So with that, I will, inshallah, share my screen. I have a little PowerPoint presentation that will hopefully, inshallah, make it easier for us to follow along, because it is going to be a semi-technical discussion here. But I think that I will leave it to the basics of the topic, inshallah, and we can use the Q&A to further dive in, inshallah. So the first thing to understand is that 55% of Americans don't have a will, okay? And that's actually a pretty startling number. But the reality is that Muslims ourselves, our percentage is much less than that. And there was a CIOGC study that was done. So they had randomly set a survey to 100 of their top donors. And they had asked them, how many of you have done estate planning? At what level have you done estate planning? Have you gotten a will done? Have you gotten a trust done? And out of the top 100 donors, and you can imagine that these individuals are probably the wealthier individuals, maybe in the $1 million range, and only a handful of them had a will, and only one had a trust out of the top 100. So that goes to show you that even though we are wealthy, we have, alhamdulillah, we have become successful. Our community is very successful. For some reason, we have neglected the estate planning portion, even though our Deen teaches us to do so. The other thing to understand as well is we'll talk about probate and what that actually means, but so much money is spent in probate court, and the reality is that the lawyers are the ones who end up making more money. At the end of the day, as much as we fight, be it in a divorce case or an estate planning case or a probate case, it's the lawyers who are making more money. And what's happening is that the more you fight, the less and less there is for the family members to actually take home. So estate planning is a generic term, and really what we're trying to do with estate planning is how do we get your assets to the next generation as simply and efficiently as possible. And there's a number of tools that we can use to accomplish that. And on the screen we have wills, we have trusts, we have family LLCs, we have healthcare power of attorneys. We have different tools that we can use to ensure that your assets go to the next generation in a simple, efficient, cost-effective manner. And so one of the highlights of why this is such an important from a legal perspective is litigation, right? So there was one case that I've had. I actually was working on this case as I was an intern in law school. I worked on this case as an associate at a law firm. And then I've been working on that case now as a partner for the last 5 years. So this particular case has been in the court system for over 7 years. And basically there was some land, and the land struck oil, and now you have family members fighting after this land, and there was no will, there was no nothing. And now, because there's so much at stake, the individuals have continued fighting over the last 7 years. So just having a simple will, for example, might have streamlined that situation. So that's really what we're talking about here, is what can we do to make sure that our family is not left in disarray. We've done so much to accumulate our estates, to accumulate our assets, to train and give tarbiyah to our children. And when we leave behind these assets without a plan, all of that goes to waste. So when it comes to having an estate plan, the way I like to actually start thinking about what estate planning is all about is what would happen to your property if you didn't have a will? What if you didn't plan anything and you were to pass away? So the first thing to realize is that your assets are going to be divided according to state law. Okay, so each and every state has come up with a generic way in which your assets will be divided, and that's called intestate succession. And obviously this formula that the state uses is not going to go according to Islamic law. It's going to be whatever generic law the state has come up with. So that might be 50% to your children and whatever is remaining equally between your children. That usually does not involve your parents, even though Islamically speaking, our parents do have a right to our estate. However, if we didn't have a will, our estate would be divided according to state law. The other thing we have to start thinking about as well is blended families, right? So there might be instances when we have our second marriage, or we have half children, or we have stepchildren. So really we have to be very particular in how we plan for that, because the state laws don't look into the Islamic principles of how that should be taken care of. The other issue that we face when we don't have an estate plan is, how will your assets be distributed? Or who's going to be in charge? And this could also become tricky because people might be incentivized to become in charge of your estate by filing a petition with the court, for example, and asking to become the executor because they know that there's a lot of money there. How will you be buried? For example, if we don't have a estate plan, we didn't have a will, what's to say, especially if we come from a non-Muslim family and we've accepted Islam, how do we make sure that our bodies are buried in the proper Islamic manner? How do we make sure that our janazah is done? So if you don't have an estate plan, your family pretty much will now decide how you're going to be buried and how your funeral will take place. The next one, how will your children be taken care of? This is so important, because if we don't identify who's going to be the guardian of our children after we pass away, you are leaving that up to the judge. You're leaving that up to the court system. And what can happen, and this is really the worst case scenario, is that people can start petitioning the court in order to become the guardians of your children, right? And sometimes, yes, that might be done out of love, but other times, and I've seen this as well, is that people are petitioning the court to get guardianship of your children because they understand that money comes with the children, right? So maybe the petitioner, there's somebody that you value their Islamic ideals, they value the same things that you value, and alhamdulillah, inshallah, that works out. However, the individuals who understand that it's an investment almost to petition the court in order to get guardianship, they might as well win as, at the end of the day, because of how much money and effort they're going to put to become the guardian of your children. So it's so important to think about and to denote and to write a will so that you can choose who is going to be the guardian of your children rather than the court. The other thing, as we go kind of through this, we'll see that without having a estate plan, your family is going to spend, I should say, extra time and extra money, right? There's extra time in figuring out who's going to be the executor, who's going to be the guardian of the children, where are all your assets, how will those assets be divided? So all of these things is something that we have to think about if we don't have an estate plan. And just the fact of who is going to be in charge of our children should really propel us if, subhanAllah, may Allah protect us if the sunnah itself doesn't do that for us. So really what the simple solution is to write a last will and testament, okay? And just like Mufti Abrar went into details about the distribution, that distribution will not take place unless you have a will, okay? So as Mufti Abrar kind of taught us, that there's certain things that have to be paid in order, okay? So we have our last illness and our funeral, that should be paid. We have our debts, that should be paid. We have that 1/3 portion that we are able to give to non-inheritors. And then finally, we have the actual inheritors that is going to be part of our will. So this is the area, or this is the document in which we can denote this. And our wills are, any will that you get, you have to make sure that your debts are going to be paid, then the 1/3 portion is going to be paid, and then the inheritors get their share. So that's what we can include in our will. The other thing that the will is going to include is going to be the assignment of the executor. So this is where we get to pick who's in charge. And now we know we've appointed that person, we've had a discussion with that person, and now that person is going to be in charge of gathering your assets and distributing your assets. The will is also going to include your burial rights, your funeral rights, making sure there's no autopsies being done, no embalming being done, making sure that when you pass away, your body's not taken across, a long distance. The will is also going to include the who's going to be your guardian of the children, right? So all of this is really the solution. Every Muslim in America needs to have a will, because if you don't, none of these things will be accounted for. We're not, going to be in compliance with our deen. We waste so much time, we waste so much money, and we're leaving everything haphazardly. And so the next thing to kind of think about is, okay, we've done this will, alhamdulillah, we've taken the step to get this will done. But the next question is, how does that will work practically speaking? Okay, so what happens when somebody passes away is that will is going to be submitted to probate court. Basically in America, in the Illinois, I should say in particular, is when you write a will, you're essentially telling the probate court what to do. Okay, so probate is a division of the court system, much like there's divorce court, there's traffic court, there's also a particular system called probate court. And so the point of probate court is to make sure that the will is valid and to supervise and make sure that the executor does what you had told them to do. Okay, so an executor would go to court, show the judge the will, and I'm obviously kind of simplifying this, show the judge the will, judge looks at it, says, okay, this is properly signed, come back in 6 months or 1 year and prove to me that these individuals have received their share. Okay, and so that's the simple process of how a will works with probate. Okay, and for the vast majority of people, that's really all you need is going to be a will. Okay, and there are other ways that we can simplify the probate process. For example, if you have less than $100,000, there's something called a small estate affidavit. Basically, it's like a 3-page form. You fill out that form, you file it with the court system, and now you have the power to gather all their assets and distribute it accordingly. So that's how probate works. And the problem with probate is obviously somebody else is now involved, right? The state is now involved, the judge is involved. there's a process, there's court dates, and that can take time and that can take effort, right? So essentially, just to kind of go into the minutia of what probate court really is what is going to go through the probate court. So for example, when you have joint property, okay, let's say husband and wife, and many of us, when we own property with our spouses. So we are owning that account or that house jointly. So if husband were to pass away, then that's going to go to the wife. You don't have to go through probate court. Basically, that becomes a non-probate asset, okay? Other things that do not go to probate are assets in trust. So we'll talk about trust, but basically, if you have an asset that's placed into a trust, that will not go through the probate process. And any accounts that you have with a beneficiary. So for example, if you have a 401k or an IRA or a life insurance policy, and you've named a beneficiary, that's going to go in accordance to what you denoted on that paper. It's not going to go through probate process. However, we have to keep in mind that just because you have joint property, and obviously, you know, there might be issues with joint property, Islamically speaking, and maybe Mufti Abrar can talk about that. But that's a really big problem that I see in estate planning, especially when we're talking about estate planning from the Islamic perspective, because joint property can really throw a wrench in how that's going to actually work in congruence and in compliance with the legal court system. So these are the types of assets that will not be included in probate. The other thing to think about that, yes, you might have joint property with your spouse, but you also have to think about what's going to happen when both parents pass away. So eventually there will be probate. So simply speaking, probate is a court supervised distribution of your assets. It can take as little as 6 months, but you know, it can take much longer than that. Like I said, that one case that I have, it's been going for over 7 years. This process can become costly. The more properties that you have, if you have property in different states, you might have to open up different proceedings in different states to make sure that that asset is being, or that house or that account is being transferred to the appropriate individuals. One thing to think about when it comes to probate is the point of probate really, yes, is to supervise the distribution of assets, but it's really to change the title, right, or the ownership of your property. So, you know, right now, if we were to look at your house, the title with the county, it's going to say, you know, Naveed Hussein and Mrs. Hussein, for example. But now for my son to get that property, we would have to, he can't just go to the county and say, okay, I own this property. The reason why probate court is there is now he's able to get an order from the judge to let the county know that now I am the rightful owner. So that's what we're doing when we're going through probate. So the real question is, how do we avoid probate? And this is really what the sophistication of estate planning really comes in, is when I'm thinking about estate planning, yes, wills are there. But for me, wills should be no questions asked. Everyone should have a will. And really what we're going to do with a estate planning client is talk to them about avoiding probate. And so, like I said before, the one way you can avoid probate is by having joint property, but that's only a limited solution, and that can cause issues when it comes to Islamic inheritance. So the major way that we can avoid probate is to have a trust, okay? And a trust is in addition to the will. So a will in a trust, a will is always going to be there, and a trust is kind of on top of a will. The will is telling the court system what to do, it's telling the state what to do, and a trust is kind of a private agreement. And what we're doing with the trust is we are essentially assigning beneficiaries to your property, okay? So right now, if you look at your house, there's no real beneficiary. But by having it placed into the trust, and we'll talk about that, what it means by placing into the trust, you are now assigning a beneficiary to that trust, okay? There's this point about separation of legal and beneficial title. And basically all that really means is that we're playing a trick, right? It's basically a legal fiction. So just like when you create a corporation and you have a business, you are now presenting yourself to the world as, Faruqi and Hussein LLC. And now when somebody writes a check, they're writing a check to Faruqi and Hussein LLC. If something bad happens, then you're going to be suing Faruqi and Hussein LLC, for example. So basically, it's a legal fiction. This doesn't really exist, but we filed some papers with the state, and now we've created this magical thing called a company. And so basically, that's what a trust is. It's a trick, it's a legal fiction, and it comes alive, or basically, it's like a document. And that document is telling the individuals involved what to do. So think of it like a box. So let's say that we have a box, and we are going to place certain things into that box. So the trust document is kind of like the shipping label that we're going to put onto the box, and essentially letting people know that, okay, whatever's in this box, get it to my 3 children, or get this box or whatever's in this to my grandchildren, and give it to them in an equal manner. So basically what we're doing by putting it in the box, we are shielding it from the state, number one, from getting involved so we can avoid probate. And number two, we are writing the directions that we want on how that property should now be taken care of and how it should be distributed. So when it comes to the benefits of a trust, it's to avoid probate or to simplify probate. Because like I said before, that can take time. It can take, you have somebody else kind of getting involved. It's really beneficial when you have out-of-state property. So if you own a rental property in a different state, or if you move from one state to another and you still have property in 2 different locations, it makes sense maybe to have a trust. The other thing that a trust can also do is protect money for the children, okay? And so there is an Islamic discussion here as well. And if there's any questions, I'm sure Mufti Abrar can kind of address it. But from the legal perspective is, instead of having the money given to your children right off the bat, right? And maybe this really, Islamically speaking, might only qualify if your child is like a spendthrift, and you would probably need to talk to a scholar to see if your child would qualify as such. But basically what would happen is that instead of the money going directly to the child after passing, this money would sit with a trustee or a manager. Basically, somebody who's in charge of holding on to that money, investing that money, and making sure that it gets to the children. So, for example, we put in the trust that my children will not get this money until 25. However, up until they're 25, they can go to the trustee, and the trustee can pay for their schooling, for their marriage, or whatever the case might be. Once they're 25, then they can get whatever is remaining from that, from their portion. So that's another thing that we can do with a trust, is we can create different elements and different systems on how that will be distributed to your children. The other benefit of certain types of trusts is going to be taxes. So, for example, there's something called a charitable lead trust, charitable remainder trust. So depending on the size of your estate, we could work out different solutions to try to increase your charitable bequests, still protecting your family, getting a tax benefit, and accomplishing the Islamic distribution as well. So there's different things that we can do with trusts. As Mufti Abrar had mentioned, there is another aspect of estate planning, which is planning for incapacity. So what we've talked about so far is really what happens after you pass away, right? But the other thing that we have to think about is, if there's a coma or some type of dementia that doesn't allow us to make decisions. And actually, if you think about the amount of money that is spent on medical bills in the last 3 months of somebody's life is very, very high, okay? And so the other 2 documents that I routinely include in estate planning is a healthcare power of attorney and a financial power of attorney. So in a healthcare power of attorney, we are essentially giving our agent, or giving somebody the authority to make decisions on our behalf as it relates to healthcare. So for example, They can decide on life support. They can decide to transfer you from one hospital to another hospital. They can decide to get a second opinion on your issue. They would have access to your medical records so that they can share that with other professionals to make sure that the best healthcare is being provided to you. So this is a very important document. Financial power of attorney. This is also very important because the will doesn't take place until you pass away. But if you are unable to make decisions, you want to make sure that somebody has access to your accounts. Somebody is able to run your business, for example. Somebody is able to write checks on your behalf or pay your bills on your behalf. So that's where the financial power of attorney would come into place. And so these are kind of involved with the will as well. And so whenever I do estate planning, I try to push people to, at the very least, have your will, your financial power of attorney, and your healthcare power of attorney. I would say that those are the three very major documents that an individual should have. And then depending on your circumstance, a trust might make sense. So a lot of people go to online wills. And in my opinion, obviously as an attorney, there's some nuances that are going to be involved in a will. But my general advice is to avoid them because they're way too general. And what happens is that a lot of times you will see that they end up attaching like a 6-10 page attachment exhibit to the will and say that, okay, now you have like if-then statements. If my mom passes away, then this. If my dad passes away, then this. If my second brother is alive, then that. And so what that does is that it confuses the situation, number one. Number two is kind of a legal point, but you are now giving standing to all these people mentioned in that will to challenge that will, okay? And so you wanna make sure that when you do a will that it's straight to the point, who's going to inherit from you, how much are they going to inherit, and limit it only to your Islamic inheritors rather than slapping on this 10-page exhibit. The other issue is that a lot of times when you print out these wills from online, people forget to sign them, right? You might have paid $100, $200 to have this, online will, but if you didn't take the time to sit with 2 witnesses and even sometimes a notary, your will is not valid. So you get this false sense of security when you get an online will, you printed it out, you pay the money, now you think you're good to go. But the reality is that that will is not valid unless it's properly signed, and I would even say notarized. The other issue too is it might not be in compliance with different state laws. Each and every state has a separate set of rules as it relates to how wills should be worded and how wills should be executed. And so if you just download a will and that was meant for example, Michigan, and you try to sign it in Illinois, that can cause problems. Islamic language, for example, you've seen with the rise of Islamophobia, for example, that if we start mentioning, sometimes you'll see in these online wills, there's like a preamble, and alhamdulillah, it's great. And we should leave advices to our children about how to be good Muslims, but not in the technical will itself, right? The legal will that's going to be submitted to court, we should leave out any mention of Sharia. We should mention, any mention of Islamic law, because we don't want a court to say, oh, these guys are trying to implement Sharia law. Let's take this out. Rather, the way that myself and other lawyers write their wills is that we just write the actual effect rather than saying that this is Islamic law. For example, 1/6 to mother, 1/6 to father, 1/8 to wife. We'll write all the fractions in there, and no one is the wiser that this is based off of Islamic law. And so really what this conversation is about is the future, right? As we've, as a community, have spent a lot of time and effort gathering our assets. We're highly educated individuals. We have multiple properties, but we haven't really dug too deep into the soil to put a real foundation, right? Many of our big institutions don't have endowments, okay? And you might have heard of endowments like the Harvard School or the Harvard University endowment. And basically what these are is a pool of money that institutions can use to continually run by itself. Because what we're seeing is that every other day we see, fundraising dinners and, donation appeals. But if we, in one generation, if we all had a will or a trust, and we use that 1/3 portion or whatever portion, less than 1/3, to our favorite organization, and said that this shall go to the ICNA Chicago endowment, and now we have $10 million endowment. Now we can run our institutions based on the endowment rather than having fundraising dinners every other month, right? The other thing that we're able to do is we're able to create charitable foundations. We're able to create trust. We're able to create, you heard of the Bill Gates Foundation, for example. If we were a little bit more sophisticated in our estate planning, we would be able to do that as well and now have an impact. One of the beauties of our deen is that we're supposed to feed people. We're supposed to help the needy. And if we were able to use our estate planning to create an organized foundation and have money feed into that from our estate planning, and what I'm talking about is not even donating during your lifetime. What I'm talking about is coming up with a plan after you pass away. This will become your sadaqah jariyah, and it is a means to establish these foundations. When you look at the hospitals that we have, when you look at the clinics and these major institutions, these came about because of proper estate planning, right? This didn't come about just because of one rich individual. This came about with the effort of multiple people working together, making sure that their estate plans and their wills conform to supporting these institutions. So, I wanted to give a little highlight of the different terminology of estate planning. Obviously, I didn't want to get too deep into the bushes about the technical aspects of a trust or a will. I just wanted to highlight the situation, allow us to understand the importance of this area, understand kind of the lingo, so that inshallah, as you speak to a lawyer, as you speak to Mufti Abrar, that we're able to have that conversation. So with that, inshallah, I'd like to thank you all for listening to my particular portion. And if you have any questions, inshallah, you can email me. And I know we're going to have a Q&A, inshallah, and so feel free to ask any questions that you may have. Jazakumullahu khairan.
Jazakallahu khairan. Assalamu alaikum. Jazakallahu khair, Brother Naveed. Inshallah, I left on the chat a couple of websites for both Mufti Abrar and Naveed Hussain, if you need to engage with them. And also, inshallah, feel free, if you guys would like to leave your contact information, feel free to add that to the chat, inshallah. At this moment, we'll be opening up for Q&A. We have a few questions that have made their way into the boxes. I encourage all of you who are in the Zoom environment, you can write it either in the chat or you can write it to your questions in the Q&A section. Or if you have a question, we have a couple of people who have their hands raised, and we can open up you for an audio question. If you're on YouTube or other sources, you can ask accordingly, and we'll try to relay it to the presenters, inshallah. And I'll try to ask them as they come. So the first question, and I'll just present it to the panel, is, and then whoever would like to answer it, inshallah. The first question is it permissible for a nephew to claim 50% of the wealth of an individual if that individual had only one female child?
I can take that one. So I think this is the type of questions that I was suggesting that it might be best to email directly. I mean, that scenario could occur. But I mean, whether it really applies for the scenario of the question or not requires ascertaining further details. So any specific questions on, percentages for different potential inheritors, I'll leave my email address in the chat, and I welcome you to send that to me directly. That way we can get all the details before we give that ruling.
Okay, inshallah. We have another question. What if a family member renounces Islam or is very non-practicing? Allah forbid, do the parents still apply the inheritance or leave this individual or leave these children out?
Okay. So that scenario depends. Allah forbid, if somebody has renounced Islam, meaning they're no longer in the fold of Islam, then the laws of inheritance are will prevent a non-Muslim from inheriting from a Muslim. So in that case, the Muslim parents cannot leave their inheritance to the non-Muslim child. That's different than if the child was, non-practicing. Then in that case, I mean, as long as the person is still within the fold of Islam, then the laws of inheritance will apply, regardless of their level of practice. But if they're no longer in the fold of Islam, then they're no longer eligible to receive inheritance from their Muslim family members.
Okay, Jazakallah khairan. Encourage those who would like to ask questions. They're welcome to ask on the chat. We have Sister Afshin here who raised her hand, so I'll go ahead and allow her to talk, inshallah. She has a question. Available because unfortunately, Sister Afshin, it's saying that you have an older version of Zoom, so it's not allowing you to talk. So I'm going to have to hold off on that. If you want to ask it in the chat, you're welcome to do so, inshallah. And if anyone is watching via YouTube, or you're welcome to ask questions, inshallah, in the live chat. I don't see anything there yet. Okay, here we go. Go ahead. You had something to add?
No, you can ask the question. There's a couple points, really good points that Hafiz Naveed brought up that I thought could be addressed as part of this Q&A, but you can go ahead. I'll address them afterward.
Sure. At what age or phase of life, i.e. after getting married, do you recommend completing a will, and how often should it be updated?
I think there's two parts there. The second part of how often it should be updated, Hafiz Naveed can answer. The first point is, see, from the Islamic perspective, once a person becomes baligh, right, you've reached puberty, you've become an adult Islamically, then all the laws of Islam apply from that point onward, meaning you are held accountable from that point onward. The training for that starts earlier, the hadith about like telling children to pray when they're 7 and, reprimanding them at the age of 10 if they're not doing it, they're not already in the habit by that age. So the preparation starts early, but the accountability starts from the time that a person is mature. So if, especially if cases where somebody has inherited some wealth already, or has other, sources of wealth, then once that person has become baligh, has become an adult Islamically, then you should take care of those responsibilities. Generally, what happens for a lot of people is, until they've started working and such, they haven't really accumulated much wealth. They are supported by their parents and such. But anyone who has accumulated any significant amount of wealth should take care of this, as soon as they have that wealth.
Yeah, and as it relates to updating your will, so I usually recommend once we do the initial will, it's going to be pretty comprehensive, inshallah, in the sense that we do account for parents passing away. So if parents pass away in the way that we in particular make wills, you don't necessarily have to update it. However, I do recommend at least once a year, maybe, just like you pick your zakat time once a year, 27th of Ramadan or whatever the case might be, maybe you pick a particular date to look at your will each year to see, okay, have the fidya or the kafara that I have to pay, has that increased? Did I complete Hajj in the last year? Who did I have additional children? Did anybody pass away? Because the percentages will change depending on who is alive at that particular time. So I would recommend that at least once a year, just as a as a practice, legally speaking as well as Islamically speaking, I think it's very important to kind of be on top of, okay, the reality of passing away and what's going to happen when I pass away. So I would say maybe once a year.
And if I can further add, the aspect of leaving behind in your will that you have certain fasts, for example, that have to be made up, and if you don't make them up, then they must be given as a fidya after you pass away from your wasiyah, your bequests. And one one way that I encourage people what to do is that in their will they should just, or somewhere they should document what's the pace at which they're making these up, how much they have starting, what's the pace that they're making it up at. And then that way, at whatever point a person passes away, someone can take a rough calculation of how much must have been remaining. But to have Naveed's point, I mean, if your pace has changed significantly, it's good to update that. Naveed, maybe you can answer another point from that one, which is, I mentioned that from the Islamic perspective, from the time that a person's baligh, which could be, like say 13, 14, even. From the legal perspective, are there any restrictions from how young can a person be who's making their will? Meaning, can a person who's under 18 make a will, for example?
Yeah, that's a good point. So yeah, unfortunately, 18 would be the time in which you would be able to make a will. Anything you sign before that, you really don't have legal capacity according to American law to really sign a contract or to sign anything. So it would really be after 18 that it would be a valid will.
Even with legal guardians' support or permission.
So, I mean, that's an interesting question. Maybe I would have to look into that. I haven't heard of anyone under 18 signing a will, but that's a really good question. Inshallah, I'll look into that.
Some of those YouTube stars probably have more money than us adults.
That's true. And maybe they would create a trust. But I would have to look into whether you can execute a will when you're under 18.
There's a question here, because Mufti Abrar, you mentioned a number of times the importance of taking care of debt. And a lot of estate that people have is like property or homes that they own, but a lot of people, they own these homes on mortgages. So if someone passes away and that home goes to, let's say, their spouse, for example, or to their children, based on the appropriate division, there's typically, if they still have mortgage on that house, is it that debt is now transferred to those who inherited that property, or is that something that should be of concern, or how do we understand that?
Yeah. So first is, somebody who passes away and they have a outstanding home financing program remaining, right? Usually any sort of debts that's created from that is a secure debt. So you have a mortgage, right? Meaning the house is mortgaged. It's a security to make sure that the remaining debt is recovered. So as long as even if a person passes away and they had outstanding debt, but that debt was secured, meaning that there was a way to settle that debt after they passed away, then that's okay. The problem is when there's when there's unsecured debts that cannot be settled after the person passes away. That's one thing. The second thing is that when a person has an ownership in something, so in a property, let's say, right? So if two people own a property together, then, and assuming they own 50% each of the property, then any debt on that property is also equally shared between them. So, if, let's say, husband and wife, they both own 50% of a house, and now the husband passes away, then the value of the 50% of the value of that house is part of that person's estate, but the 50% of that debt on that house was also part of that person's estate. So, as we said, when you're doing distribution of the estate, you first subtract burial expense, and the second thing you subtract is debts. So you won't distribute the value of the house without first subtracting the debt that was also in the share of that person. Now, if the other aspect here would be then, in terms of how you distribute the house. Usually people don't sell the house and give money out. So one person may continue to remain in the house, and how you settle that is kind of a separate discussion. But what's important to note is that the debt doesn't really transfer over to somebody else. The debt is subtracted from that person's estate.
Yeah, and this is also a pretty interesting legal issue as well, because as I was kind of mentioning earlier, that when it comes to joint property, so when husband and wife own a property jointly, according to Illinois law, you each own that property 100%. And Islamically, that doesn't make sense, right? How can you own something, both of you 100% each? So that causes a problem. So what would happen in that particular scenario, if when husband passes away, his 100% share diminishes, and now the wife's 100% share still is alive. So basically that, according to Illinois law, for example, that house now belongs to wife 100%. And now she has the ability to refinance that mortgage into her own name, or if she was a signer on the mortgage, then she would just continue paying on that mortgage. So one of the other things that I was thinking about adding in, but it might make sense here, is the problem with joint property when it comes to estate planning and divorce cases is that maybe as a community we should start thinking about, does it really make sense to hold joint property, or should we start thinking about having property owned individually or in partnership with our wives rather than owning it jointly, because it can cause problems when it comes to estate planning and divorce. So if there's any questions about that, feel free to ask. And I'm sure Mufti Abrar has his own opinion when it comes to how joint property should work. But I personally think it's a problem when it comes to estate planning and divorce, unfortunately.
Yeah, and this is, the joint property issue is not just in homes, but it's also in bank accounts, right? So you have a joint bank account. Two people can't own 100% of the same thing, right? In Islamically, as Hafiz Naveed mentioned, people's shares must add up to 100%. So these are things also that should be clarified. Hafiz Naveed covered from the legal perspective, but also from the Islamic perspective. This is something that must be clarified to avoid disputes. The husband and wife pass away, but the wife, they had a joint bank account. Husband and wife, the husband passed away, but they had a joint bank account. Wife wasn't working. The husband was working for the past, 50 years. And now, because it's in both of their names, one is you have the legal aspect of legally the wife may own 100%, but even from an Islamic perspective, that you need to make sure that it's not that the children say that no, really all that money should be the father's, and hence we should get a distribution. And now the mother or the wife, she says that no, we both owned it, so it's 50-50. And things like those sort of disputes can come in. So anytime you have joint property or joint ownership of something, it's best to clarify what is the actual Shari'i distribution of the ownership.
It's interesting. I haven't seen any more questions coming in either in any of the platforms. Mufti Abrar, feel free to add if you had some extra thoughts you had while maybe other people are thinking of questions, inshallah. Otherwise,
yeah,
include the program.
I think one joint ownership was one that Hafiz Naveed brought up that we just covered. The other one that Hafiz Naveed had also mentioned was about delaying giving money to inheritors. So Islamically, once a person passes away, then that ownership has transferred, right? The deceased don't own wealth. So now that wealth belongs to their inheritors according to their percentages, that ownership should now be given to the owners without unnecessary delay. So the possession of their ownership should be given, essentially. There are certain cases, however, where if a person doesn't hold the mental faculty to manage their own wealth, then you don't have to give them the control over the wealth. Though it's still their wealth, but you don't have to necessarily give them the control to transact in it as they wish. This can range from somebody who actually has some medical mental issues, or it could be where somebody is just completely irresponsible with wealth, has no money management skills, if you will. Then there could be certain cases where, although it's their wealth, it is permissible to put certain restrictions where, as Hafiz Naveed mentioned, somebody can be the appointee to spend for that person's needs in a responsible manner, as opposed to giving that person control. But even that has a limit of up to a certain age of like 25, for example, or 25, the age of 25, Islamically 25. But these are exceptions. This is not the rule. So a person can't just come in and just say, I'm going to make a trust or such, or I'm going to make a will, and in that one, in that I'm just going to automatically put that this person cannot get this wealth until they finish college, until they get married, until they turn a certain age that you determine is a responsible age, right? That can't just be done as a default. That is only done in exceptions. So that's something to be mindful of.
Jazakallah khairan. I think that there are no more questions coming in, inshallah ta'ala, and we are at the end of our program. Anyone, I just want to remind everyone, mashallah, Mufti Abrar and Naveed, they both left their direct contact information, which is very generous of them. So if you have any questions, definitely reach out. I had the privilege of having my will completed with Naveed's firm. And it was very smooth, it was very thorough, and it was very helpful, because when it comes to money and when it comes to anything legal, I'm just the most ignorant person in the world. So if you're anything like me, then seek out our experts that we have here to ask and consult with them, inshallah, and they're generous enough to give us their information so that you can do so, inshallah. So please reach out to them. Continue to enjoy. Hopefully, those of you who are on YouTube, subscribe to our page, and hopefully we'll have other opportunities to learn from our speakers here, inshallah, and opportunities to engage with all of you, inshallah. So I'd like to thank Naveed and Mufti Abrar, inshallah, for joining us. Allah reward you. I know Mufti Abrar says, I'd like to just focus on Ramadan. And I said, no, please. So I really appreciate it. May Allah reward you both tremendously. And everyone, thank you. Inshallah, have a wonderful day, and keep us in your dua, inshallah, as you open your fast later, inshallah. Subhanakallah wa bihamdika, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa barakatuh.
أيديكم وأرجلكم من خلاف ولأصلبنكم في جذوع النخل ولتعلمن أينا أشد عذابا وأبقى قالوا لن نؤثرك على ما جاءنا من البينات والذي فطرنا فاقض ما أنت قاض إنما تقضي هذه الحياة الدنيا إنا آمنا بربنا ليغفر لنا خطايانا وما أكرهتنا عليه من السحر والله خير وأبقى إنه من يأت ربه مجرما فإن له جهنم لا يموت فيها ولا يحيا ومن يأته مؤمنا قد عمل الصالحات فأولئك لهم الدرجات العلى جنات عدن تجري من تحتها الأنهار خالدين فيها وذلك جزاء من تزكى ولقد أوحينا إلى موسى أن أسر بعبادي فاضرب لهم طريقا في البحر يبسا لا تخاف دركا ولا تخشى فأتبعهم فرعون بجنوده فغشيهم من اليم ما غشيهم وأضل فرعون قومه وما هدى يا بني إسرائيل قد أنجيناكم من عدوكم ووعدناكم جانب الطور الأيمن ونزلنا عليكم المن والسلوى كلوا من طيبات ما رزقناكم ولا تطغوا فيه فيحل عليكم غضبي ومن يحلل عليه غضبي فقد هوى وإني لغفار لمن تاب وآمن وعمل صالحا ثم اهتدى